All right, guys, let's take a look at the Civil War in just the year 1863. Let's talk about a few essential questions. These are ones I want you to think about while we're looking at some of the details of this very pivotal year. It was a critical year in the Civil War. It really was the turning point. So, first, after 2 years of war, how was the nation already changing? What impact did the Emancipation Proclamation have in the short term and in the long term on African Americans? And then lastly, how did the tide of war begin to turn in the North's favor? Several things we're going to look at in this PowerPoint. This is not from the textbook, but this is information that I think is really critical to us to understand. And so we're kind of going outside the book a little bit in looking at things like the Emancipation Proclamation, the battle at Chancellorsville, Vicksburg, and then the turning point battles in the east of Gettysburg, and then Chickamauga and Chattanooga. With the Emancipation Proclamation given by Abraham Lincoln, after the apparent, and that's kind of a key word, apparent victory by the Union at the Battle of Antietam in Maryland, it gave Abraham Lincoln a real platform to give this speech. For the first 2 years of the war, it had just been about preserving the Union. And then Abraham Lincoln realized that he needed some kind of moral issue in order to continue to get the support up north. And he decided that that moral issue was going to be slavery and freeing the slaves. So with the North not losing the battle, but not really winning Antietam either, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And through that, it was going to give a rallying cry or rallying reason for the North to continue to fight, because now there was moral ground. And then it was going to help secure those border states like Maryland and Kentucky and West Virginia and Missouri. On this slide, if you guys would just click as an assignment, click the link below. And I want you to be able to read the Emancipation Proclamation written by Abraham Lincoln. And you can find this on the National Archives. If the link doesn't work for you, then just Google the Emancipation Proclamation, and it'll bring up a document for you to be able to read. The Battle of Chancellorsville in May of 1863, we see again a new Union general by the name of General Joseph Hooker. He was known as Fighting Joe, and he will cross the Rappahannock River to go and attack Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee does something that no one should ever do when in the face of a superior force, in other words, more men than Robert E. Lee had, is what Hooker had. Robert E. Lee will split his army in half, and then he'll attack the Union Army in 3 different places. And the Battle of Chancellorsville was just kind of an overwhelming win for the Confederacy. But it came at a price, a lot of losses. And the one thing Robert E. Lee didn't have was he didn't have a huge supply of men, so he couldn't lose thousands upon thousands, because the South doesn't have 22 million people like the North does. The greatest loss at Chancellorsville is going to be the death of Stonewall Jackson. Jackson is going to be on reconnaissance on horseback. He's going to come back at night. There's going to be a picket or a group of Confederate men that are looking for the Union to try to maybe sneak into the Confederate camp, and they're going to mistake Jackson for being a Union soldier, and so in the middle of the night they're going to fire, and they're going to wound him in the arm. He's going to have that arm amputated, but Jackson is going to be a casualty of disease. Instead of dying on the battlefield, he's going to catch pneumonia while he's recuperating from the amputation, and is going to die of pneumonia. That's going to be a huge loss for Robert E. Lee, is Stonewall Jackson. Let's move over to the west. Ulysses S. Grant has moved from Shiloh, still looking to preserve or to take the Mississippi River, and he's going to move to the Confederate fortress city of Vicksburg. Vicksburg was a heavily fortified city. It guarded a bend in the Mississippi River, and you never would be able to control the Mississippi if you did not take the city of Vicksburg. And so Grant wants to be able to split the Confederacy, move men and equipments and goods up and down the river. So he needs to take Vicksburg. When you look at this picture just kind of gives you a great idea. You can see kind of the Union soldiers that are there sieging the city of Vicksburg, the Confederate flag up on the hill, and you can see how tight of a turn it was out there where the Mississippi River makes this bend. And if you controlled the heights, if you controlled and had guns on the top, nobody would be able to travel up and down the Mississippi. So Vicksburg was a very important city. The first assault on Vicksburg was a failure, so Grant decides on a new tactic. He moves his men about 30 miles downriver, crosses the Mississippi, and he's going to come up against the city on the other side. And he's going to move up on the back of Vicksburg and try to surround it. From the 22nd of May, 1863 until the 3rd of July, the Union is just constantly bombarding the city from the land and from the river. Gunboats, ironclads, cannons on the land, they're just constantly pounding the city and the people of Vicksburg. The Confederates army that was in Vicksburg was so weakened by disease and starvation and just this constant bombardment that General Pemberton, who is commanding the Confederates in Vicksburg, decides to accept Ulysses S. Grant's unconditional surrender offer. And he surrenders the Confederate Army at Vicksburg to Ulysses S. Grant on the 4th of July, 1863. Interestingly, that will be such a painful day in the memory of the people of Vicksburg that for the next 100 years, they will not celebrate the 4th of July. If you look at that map, you can just kind of get an idea of how the Mississippi River bends right there. And you can see where the city of Vicksburg is right there on the right-hand side. And it was a critical city to take. Now, Vicksburg is actually the turning point for the war in the West. And after Ulysses S. Grant wins the battle at Vicksburg, then they've pretty much secured most of the Mississippi River. Farragut will move down and take the city of New Orleans. And now Abraham Lincoln decides to move Ulysses S. Grant to the Eastern Theater and put him in some critical battles over there because he sees in Grant a commander that wants to win. Before we leave and move to Grant coming over here in the East, let's look at one other big battle that was happening simultaneously with the Battle of Vicksburg, and that was in the small fields around the town of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. It's going to be a turning point battle in the East, and Robert E. Lee would suffer his first huge defeat at Gettysburg. Geography is going to play an important role in the Battle of Gettysburg. The army that could occupy the high ground is going to win the day. And some of the geographical places in the Battle of Gettysburg is a place called the Devil's Den, Little Round Top, Big Round Top, Cemetery Ridge, and Seminary Hill. Robert E. Lee was approved to invade the North in the summer of 1863, so he moves out of Virginia and moves into Pennsylvania. They thought that if they took the war to the North, and terrorized maybe the population in Pennsylvania, that Abraham Lincoln would try to find maybe a peace treaty or something. With the death of Stonewall Jackson, a new Confederate general cavalry general is in place, and his name is Jeb Stuart, and he's now the commander of Robert E. Lee's cavalry. Gettysburg, General Lee learns that General Joseph Hooker has replaced General Meade, or has been replaced, sorry, by General Meade, and Robert E. Lee sees General Meade as maybe a hesitator, somebody who will stop and think and plan. So immediately Robert E. Lee moves to attack Meade. Union forces are the first ones to arrive in Gettysburg, and they take the high ground. Some people say that the Battle of Gettysburg actually started over shoes. There was a shoe factory in the town of Gettysburg, and both the Union and Confederate armies had heard about the shoe factory, and they needed shoes. So as they both moved to get there first, then we have the Battle of Gettysburg that began. In this picture, you can see 3 Confederate soldiers that were taken prisoner after the Battle of Gettysburg. After the first day, July the 1st, Union losses were higher than the Confederates, but they did not surrender the high ground. Meade now placed his army on top of Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill on the right, and along Cemetery Ridge in the center and the Little Round Top on the left. General Lee learns that after the second day, on July the 2nd, the Confederates gain ground, but don't gain any of the high ground, and Robert E. Lee orders a new attack, but his confidence is shaken with his apparent lack of success, where he had been able to outmaneuver, outgeneral the previous ones. He wasn't able to do that right now with Meade, and he was getting frustrated with himself. And on the third day, the Confederate losses were very, very high. We have what was called Pickett's Charge, where across the open cornfield, General Pickett 3 times tries to charge the Union line, and the vast majority of his men were just slaughtered. And when he came back, somebody said, General Meade, where is your brigade? And he answers the man and says, Sir, I have no brigade. At the end of July the 3rd, the Union losses were about 23,000 men, and the Confederates around 25,000. So a lot of dead and wounded at Gettysburg. And on the same day that the city of Vicksburg is surrendering to Grant in Mississippi, on July the 4th, Robert E. Lee is retreating in defeat back into Virginia. I put a few pictures in here for you to see. These are 4 pictures that were taken this summer at the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. So the people that took these, you can see they're really good pictures. As thousands of reenactors came to a farm not far from the national battlefield at Gettysburg, and did a reenactment of the battle from 150 years ago. A turning point in the war. With the West now lost and the Confederacy divided, attention now turns to a very critical city, which was the city of Chattanooga. Just here north of us, about an hour and a half, Chattanooga was absolutely on the Union target as a city they needed to capture. And they send Union General Rosecrans to fight Confederate General Braxton Bragg over the city of Chattanooga. General Bragg begins to reinforce. He takes the high ground up on Lookout Mountain that oversees the city of Chattanooga. Chattanooga at this point was really not that big of a town. It only had about 3,500 people, but it was a railroad center. You had a northwest railroad that ran from Atlanta to Chattanooga, and then from Chattanooga on towards Richmond. And then you had an east-west railroad that ran from Chattanooga out to Memphis. So it was a critical converging point of a lot of railroads. If you took the city of Chattanooga, you opened up the gateway to the Deep South. And so both sides knew that they needed to keep this city. The first battle in Chattanooga, General Braxton Bragg decides to retreat off of the mountain to surrender the high ground. And when he does, he decides that he's going to regroup in North Georgia. The Union Army gets up on the top of Lookout, and all the Confederates were gone. General Rosecrans believes that the Confederates are in full retreat back towards Atlanta, and so he just decides to send his army pursuing the Confederates with really not first trying to find out where they are. When I put there about Confederate dust, what General Bragg had done is he had his Confederate cavalry tie tree limbs to the back of the horses and just ride down the road, kicking up all kinds of dust, making the Union soldiers think that the entire Confederate army was in full retreat, when in fact they weren't. About 10 miles from Chattanooga is a little town in North Georgia called Chickamauga, and the Confederate Army had decided to turn. They chose the battlefield, they chose the ground on which they wanted to fight, and so they just decided to sit and wait in the open fields and the heavy wooded areas around Chickamauga, and the Union Army just ran right into the Confederates. And not being set up and prepared at all. The trap had been set, and the trap was sprung. At Chickamauga, we have about 35,000 casualties. It was really one of the bloodiest wars or battles of the Civil War, and it was said that the creek that runs through there, Chickamauga Creek, ran red with the blood that was spilled at the Battle of Chickamauga. General Rosecrans has to retreat back into the city of Chattanooga. Chickamauga is a huge victory for the Confederates, and now the city of Chattanooga is under siege. After Grant wins the Battle of Vicksburg, he is brought to relieve the siege of Chattanooga. He brings a guy by the name of General Sherman with him, and in November of 1863, they begin an assault on Lookout Mountain, which becomes known as the Battle Above the Clouds. The clouds and the fog hung really low on the mountain, so actually both sides couldn't see each other. The Union couldn't see the top of the mountain. The Confederates on the top couldn't see the Union forces moving up. Because of that, you really can't fire your cannons accurately, and the Confederates will have to retreat from Lookout Mountain. After Lookout Mountain, Ulysses S. Grant relieves the siege of Chattanooga, brings in new men and new supplies, and then you have the assault on Missionary Ridge. Confederates were all entrenched on the top of Missionary Ridge. Ulysses S. Grant just puts in a great battle plan and actually removes them, and the Confederates have to now retreat back into the into North Georgia. So the city of Chattanooga and all of its railroads, the open door to the south, is now firmly in Union hands. With the Battle of Chattanooga, Lookout Mountain, and Missionary Ridge over with, Ulysses S. Grant is ordered by Abraham Lincoln to return to Washington, where he is going to take command of the Army of the Potomac, and he is given one set of orders: to find and destroy Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. Ulysses S. Grant leaves to go back to Washington, but he leaves General Sherman here in charge of the army in Chattanooga. And Sherman will begin his slow march south towards the city of Atlanta. All right, guys, that's it for the key things of 1863. Hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.